Okay, today will be our last live session of the semester. We're going to do a Unit 3 exam review. I'm going to start with John Stuart Mill, and then we're going to look at Nietzsche, Sartre, and then Theodore Dalrymple. So let's start with John Stuart Mill. I have 3 separate recordings I put together. We're just going to watch each of these in sequence.
And lastly, we will look at John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a hedonistic ethical theory which views the maximization of pleasure as good, and it views pain as evil. Mill encapsulates this idea in the greatest happiness principle, which states that an action is ethical insofar as, or to the degree that, it contributes to the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. So to live morally and virtuously as a utilitarian, you need to live in a way that creates the greatest amount of pleasure for society. And this often includes self-sacrificial actions. So this is not a selfish or egoistic ethical theory. However, not all pleasures are equal, according to John Stuart Mill. He makes a very sharp distinction between higher and lower pleasures. The lower pleasures are the base, passive, animalistic pleasures that require no intelligence. They do not harness our higher faculties, but they are pleasures that we share with the animals. And you can give examples on your own. The higher pleasures are those that are unique to human beings, and they are active. They use our intellectual faculties, our imagination, our creativity, our taste for the beautiful. And Mill says that anyone who experiences both types of pleasures will always prefer the higher to the lower. Lastly, think for a moment about the important distinction Mill makes between external versus internal sanctions. What are sanctions? A sanction is a penalty for breaking a rule or a law. An external sanction would be, for example, getting arrested or fined, or getting censored or canceled or ostracized. And the fear of these external punishments are enough for many people to do the right thing and live in an ethical manner. But Mill says that the most powerful kinds of sanctions would be the internal sanctions. That's where your conscience guides you in the right direction. And if you do something wrong, your conscience will tell you that, and you will feel the sting of your conscience. And that is a much more powerful way of enforcing correct action and good behavior than merely the threat of an external punishment. That's a very deep thought. You should give it some consideration. All right, well, I wanted to keep this short, and I succeeded. So here we are at the end of our test review.
Okay, that's not actually the end of our test review. This is from a previous iteration of this class. I used to have the John Stuart Mill chapter in Unit 2. So disregard that comment about the end of the test review. So now I want to switch gears to Nietzsche and Sartre. Let me do a screen share. All right.
Okay, we're going to do a very brief Unit 3 exam review. As I've stated in other reviews, the best way to prepare is to carefully do the chapter reading assignments and study the commentaries, as well as take the practice quizzes before you take the test.
Okay, please note that in this class, we do not have practice quizzes, so please disregard that. We only have the unit tests, the discussions, and the papers, and of course the reviews. So disregard the practice quizzes. We do not use those here.
All right, so let's look at the Nietzsche chapter. Nietzsche is not an egalitarian. He believes that equality is a distortion of reality. Human beings are not equal. They are very unequal. A noble society is one that is hierarchically structured with the very best human types at the top and everyone else in a subservient role. Now, this is very offensive to the ears of many egalitarians, which is the bulk of us in 21st century America. But let's try to understand Nietzsche's arguments on their own terms. Okay, so how do aristocratic societies come into being? Through conquest, says Nietzsche. Life is will to power. Will to power is a term Nietzsche uses to describe a life force that burns and pulses in every living thing, and especially human beings and even whole societies are animated by it in different degrees. The greater human types, the nobler aristocratic human types, have a greater degree of will to power in them. The weaker, slavish human beings have very little vitality in them, and they are characterized by a dearth of will to power. Will to power is essentially the desire to expand, to grow, to conquer, and to exploit. And the more of that you have, the higher up you are in the hierarchy. But it's important to recognize that for Nietzsche, a sign of the greatest strength is not so much your ability to conquer outside nations or to kill other human beings, but rather your ability to master yourself. So self-discipline is a sign of the highest human type. This brings us to the distinction between master morality and slave morality. Master morality divides up the good from the bad. Those who are good are those who have strength, courage, resilience, pride, ambition, those who hold themselves to the very highest standards, who demand only the very best of themselves and of others. That is what defines someone as good in master morality. Bad would be the absence of all the qualities that make one good. You can infer what those would be: meekness, resentment, pettiness, cowardice, mediocrity, etc. Among the aristocratic societies that have existed, Nietzsche points to the Roman, Arabic, German, and Japanese nobility, as well as the Scandinavian Vikings. Slave morality, by contrast, is born out of resentment. The envy and the jealousy experienced by the lower types of human beings toward those whom they recognize as superior. In slave morality, there are two value terms, good and evil. And they basically invert the terms from master morality. So in slave morality, good signifies meekness, weakness, humility, and so forth. All of those kind of lower qualities that you find in the designation bad in master morality. And likewise, the qualities that make one noble in master morality are assigned to the status of evil. So it's a complete inversion of master morality. All right, let's move on to Sartre. Sartre is a 20th century atheist existentialist philosopher who wants to lay out all of the implications for human life of the realization that we live in a godless universe. He takes atheism as his point of departure. He's famous for his statement that existence precedes essence, by which he means that since there is no creator who makes us, we simply turn up. We exist without any particular reason why. We exist before we become who we are. We don't have a predetermined essence. The way we acquire an essence is through our freely chosen actions throughout our lives. So for Sartre, our essence is our biography. Man is nothing else except what he makes of himself through his freely chosen actions. So your life is like a blank canvas, and the meaning of your life is the brushstrokes on that canvas that are represented by your actions throughout the course of your life. So you are an artist, and your life is a canvas painted with various brushstrokes that represent how you have chosen to live your life. So you bear full and total responsibility for how you turn out. And there are three key emotional states that characterize Sartre's existentialism, and they are anguish, forlornness, and despair. You will be required to answer questions on the exam on these three emotional states, so you will want to cover that in the text very carefully. For the Theodore Dalrymple questions, you only need to study the quiz questions from that chapter because they will reappear on the test. All right, I wanted to keep this short, and it looks like I succeeded in doing so. Thank you for listening, and good luck on the test.
Okay, so please disregard this last bit about chapter quiz questions. Again, we don't have chapter quiz questions in this class. So for the Dalrymple questions, I'm going to do a Dalrymple lecture that I'm going to play a lecture that I created over the Dalrymple readings. So this one's about almost 32 minutes long, but I go in depth on the Dalrymple readings. So I hope you find this informative. So I'm going to go ahead and do a screen share for you. Okay, welcome to our chapter on Theodore Dalrymple. Now, Dalrymple is a pen name or pseudonym for Anthony Daniels, who is a retired psychiatrist. He practiced in a slum hospital as well as a prison hospital in England for 14 years. And before that, he traveled all over the world, particularly the Third World, as a practicing doctor.
Very interesting man, very interesting writer. I would say he's one of the greatest living essayists in the English language. His focus is human nature. What makes us tick? Why do we live the way that we do? What is the human soul? And I think those are some of the most important questions in philosophy. These are questions that affect everybody. These are not questions for specialists. If you want to understand how to live well and how to understand how one might avoid living badly, then you have to confront these kinds of questions. And Dalrymple does a really excellent job of getting to the heart of the matter. So let's start with the frivolity of evil. We're going to look at a couple of quotes for each article. And I'm just going to make a few brief remarks and then move on to the next article. So let's start with the first quote. Yet the scale of a man's evil is not entirely to be measured by its practical consequences. Men commit evil within the scope available to them. So let me begin by making an important distinction between two fundamentally opposing ways of looking at human nature. The first is the tragic view. The tragic view, well, we'll call it the tragic view. According to the tragic view, human nature is essentially flawed or defective or imperfect. And everything that we do, everything that we make, everything that we participate in will never be perfect. It will have some flaw or defect. With respect to evil, our flawed nature expresses itself in our willingness to commit evil if we have the opportunity to do so with impunity. Of course, we can't be too general. Not every single human being will commit evil if they have the chance to get away with it. But there is something in the human heart, according to the tragic view at least, that impels us or incites us to commit evil if we have the chance to do so. I'm not talking about mass murder necessarily, but even small things, like running a red light if there's no camera there and there's no cars on the other side of the intersection, or keeping that extra $5 bill that the cashier at the grocery store gives you by mistake when you get your change back. It could be something as insignificant or seemingly trivial as that, right? And all the way up the scale to higher sorts of injustices. That there's just something in the dark human heart that predisposes us to do bad things. And that's just woven into the nature of humanity. And that it is the purpose of education, it's the purpose of parenting, it's the purpose of good laws, it's the purpose of philosophy to help us restrain those dark impulses in the human heart, to restrain them. They can never eradicate them, according to the tragic view. So the best we can hope for is to minimize or mitigate the injustices or the evils that human beings are by nature want to commit. That's the tragic view. So it's not a sunny, optimistic view. But for Dalrymple and for philosophers like Hobbes, Plato, and Nietzsche, it is an honest view. It is the correct way of looking at human nature, right? Let's contrast the tragic view with the utopian view, which is on the opposite end of the scale. The utopian view comes from the word utopia, which is a Greek term meaning good place. A utopia is essentially a perfect society. So the term utopia presupposes, it assumes that human beings can be perfected, that they can perfect themselves. And Karl Marx is a perfect embodiment of the kind of thinking that promotes the view that utopia is possible. According to Marxism, or Karl Marx rather, history is progressing towards a state of affairs in which there are no classes, there are no socioeconomic classes, that society will become perfectly equal, that private property will disappear and will be redistributed equally among the members of the community, and there will be no more poverty, crime, injustice, discrimination, corruption, etc. That society, all the human evils that plague every society, that have plagued every society for thousands of years, will vanish completely once we deal with the problem of private property, which for Marx is at the root of all injustice and all evil. So Marx has the utopian view that you can, in fact, achieve a perfect society, that human nature is perfectible. So those are the two ways of looking at humanity. Dalrymple subscribes to the tragic view, and we'll come back to that in a moment. The second quote: there is something to be said here about the word depression, which has almost entirely eliminated the word and even the concept of unhappiness from modern life. Of the thousands of patients I have seen, only 2 or 3 have ever claimed to be unhappy. All the rest have said that they were depressed. This is a fascinating distinction. We hear the word depression all the time, all the time. On TV, you can't watch TV for more than an hour without seeing at least one commercial from a pharmaceutical company advertising some kind of pill that's supposed to help treat your depression. Unhappiness is very different, though, right? Depression is a medical notion, right? If you're depressed, it is because of some kind of brain chemical imbalance that can be remedied, can be fixed or tweaked through the right administration of drugs. And then you're okay again. Unhappiness, on the other hand, presupposes that it is not a medical condition, but rather a condition of the soul, that your soul is sick. And more often than not, when our soul is sick, it is a result of choices that we have made, bad choices that we have made in life that have put us in a condition in which we are unhappy. Right? So imagine someone who drops out of high school at age 17 because he doesn't like doing math, doesn't like homework. He drops out of high school, doesn't really think ahead, doesn't have any foresight, doesn't really anticipate all the negative consequences that will ensue from being a high school dropout. He gets a job at a supermarket as a night stalker, making just above minimum wage. He wakes up one day, he's 30 years old, he's still living in an efficiency apartment on the bad side of town. He can't afford a car, so he has to take a bus every day, 1 hour each way. He's got to change buses 2 or 3 times. He's living paycheck to paycheck. Then he decides to start selling drugs on the side to make ends meet. He gets arrested, gets a mandatory minimum of 20 years, and he's rotting away in prison, middle-aged, no accomplishments in life, completely miserable. Would it be more correct to refer to his condition as depression or unhappiness? I think we might agree, most of us might agree, that his condition is one of unhappiness. It's not attributable to a chemical imbalance in the brain. Rather, it is attributable to the terrible life choices he has made, starting with his decision to drop out of high school and ending with his decision to embrace a life of crime. So what Dalrymple is trying to get us to see here is that many people who claim to be depressed are really unhappy. But it is very convenient to convince ourselves that we're depressed when in fact we're really unhappy, because depression is a medical condition that the doctor can treat. And it absolves us from any kind of moral responsibility for how we have chosen to live our lives. Whereas unhappiness is a more honest term to diagnose our misery, because unhappiness forces us to recognize that our sad condition may in fact be the result of poor choices we have made in life. And until we can make this distinguish and be honest with ourselves, we will continue to live badly, or people who claim to be depressed will continue to live badly. Okay, let's turn now to how and how not to love mankind. Fascinating article in which Dalrymple compares and contrasts the worldview or the understanding of human nature embodied in Karl Marx, the famous communist thinker, and Ivan Turgenev, the equally famous Russian author. They were both born on the same day, and they both died on the same day, which is really fascinating. They had a number of life experiences that were similar, and yet their visions of humanity could not have been more opposed to one another. Let's look at these two quotes. Both men, Marx and Turgenev, were known for their sympathy with the downtrodden and oppressed. But for all their similarities of education and experience, the quality of each man's compassion could not have been more different. For while one's, rooted in the suffering of individuals, was real, he's referring to Turgenev, the other's, abstract and general, was not. He's referring to Marx. Turgenev saw human beings as individuals always endowed with consciousness, character, feelings, and moral strengths and weaknesses. Marx saw them always as snowflakes in an avalanche, as instances of general forces, as not yet fully human because utterly conditioned by their circumstances. Where Turgenev saw men, Marx saw classes of men. Where Turgenev saw people, Marx saw the people. These two ways of looking at the world persist into our own time and profoundly affect, for better or for worse, the solutions we propose to our social problems. So Marx looked at humanity in terms of broad categories or classes. He saw human beings as abstractions. He divided up humanity into two basic classifications: the proletariat, which refers to the workers, the oppressed workers who do not own anything. They sell their labor for a pitiful wage. And then the other class was the bourgeoisie, which refers to the white collar owners of the means of production, factory owners, management, and so forth, who owned the companies and the factories that employed the proletarians at their pitiful wages. So he did not see human beings as flesh and blood individuals, but as members of these abstract classes, which were themselves consumed by this engine of progress, this historical force that was moving humanity closer and closer towards the goal of the communist revolution and the final stage, the utopian communist society, where there would be no more private property and everyone would be equal and happy, right? Turgenev, on the other hand, saw human beings as flesh and blood creatures that were endowed with free will and consciousness, and they had dignity and humanity and autonomy, and they were animated by their own private hopes and fears and dreams and passions and emotions. So Turgenev saw human beings as individuals. Marx saw them only as members of a class. This is similar, by the way, to the distinction between unhappiness and depression that we referred to earlier. The depressed person is merely a victim of forces outside of his control. He's powerless against those forces, which is why he needs the intervention of a pharmaceutical agent to sort of restore the balance in his brain chemistry. But without that pill, he is powerless to do anything about his condition. The condition controls him, and in that sense that he's dehumanized. The unhappy person is not powerless. The unhappy person put himself in that miserable condition by making bad choices in life, by exercising his free will to choose the bad as opposed to the good. And he can similarly use his free will, his autonomy, his agency to improve his condition, to rid himself of his miserable condition and become happy again by making different lifestyle choices, more prudential, more wise lifestyle choices, and thereby achieve true happiness. So the Turgenev, right, sees human beings in just that way, as imbued with a intrinsic dignity and autonomy, rooted in their free will and their agency, and that elevates them. That recognizes the intrinsic dignity of the human being. Whereas for Marx, human beings are simply, as Dalrymple puts it, snowflakes in an avalanche. That's a beautiful image, because that's essentially how Marx sees human beings, as always under the control of external forces. In other words, passive. Whereas Turgenev saw human beings as active. Let's turn to Ibsen and his discontents. This is a fascinating article. Ibsen, of course, was a very famous playwright. Let's look at the first quote. Johnson, and here Dalrymple refers to Samuel Johnson, very famous author, English author. Johnson saw human existence as inseparable from dissatisfaction. By the way, that's the tragic view. Again, the tragic view is the sort of pessimistic notion that human life, human nature is flawed and imperfect, and that we can never achieve perfection. Now, we can make progress towards mitigating our defects, lessening the severity of our defects, but we can never eradicate them altogether. So there will always be some admixture of unhappiness, of ugliness, if you will, in human life, which doesn't mean that you cannot live a good life. It just means that you cannot live a perfect life. Okay, so Johnson saw human existence as inseparable from dissatisfaction. It is man's nature to suffer from incompatible desires simultaneously. For example, wanting both security and excitement. By the way, this is a fascinating insight, and I find it very compelling. Probably the strongest argument in favor of the tragic view of life, in my view, I'm just giving you my own view, is the unavoidability for human beings of having mutually exclusive or incompatible desires. I think that is the nature of the human condition, is to want two or more things that conflict with one another. He gives the example of security and excitement. That's a perfect example. But if you think about your own life, you reflect on your own life, on your own ambitions, your own desires, your own hopes, if you really reflect carefully, you will start to find contradictions. You will start to see that desire A is not compatible with desire B, which means you cannot have them both. You have to pick one. And if you have to pick one, that means you don't get to have the other. And that means that you will be, to some degree, dissatisfied because you cannot have everything that you want. And that is, I think, the mystery, or part of the mystery of the human condition, is that we cannot seem to escape the condition whereby we want two things or more than two things that do not cohere with one another, that are not compatible with one another. And that necessarily leads to frustrated desire, which necessarily leads to some degree of dissatisfaction. And that is life. You have to deal with that. If your goal is perfection, if your goal is to have everything that you could ever want at the same time, you will necessarily be dissatisfied. So as long as you learn to accept that we cannot have everything that we want, and we make compromises and trade-offs, that at least can give us some consolation that we did the best that we could with what we had. Okay, let me finish the quote. When he has one, he longs for the other, so that contentment is rarely unalloyed and never lasting. It's a fascinating quote. Next quote. However, most people find it more comforting to believe in perfectibility than in imperfectibility. An example of what Dr. Johnson called the triumph of hope over experience. Beautiful phrase. So who in their right mind would not rather have perfectibility than imperfectibility? I, for one, would rather be perfect than imperfect. And I'm sure you are no different from me in that respect. But just because we want something, just because we long for something, doesn't mean that that goal is actually attainable. In this case, according to Dalrymple, it is not attainable. Perfectibility is not attainable. Coming back to the quote, the notion of imperfectibility not only fans existential anxieties, but also, by precluding simple solutions to all human problems, places much tougher intellectual demands upon us than utopianism does. So it's a lot more difficult to deal with complex problems when you recognize that there are no easy solutions. And utopian solutions, by the way, are simplistic and easy solutions, according to Dalrymple. For Karl Marx, you might recall, all you have to do in order to usher in a perfect utopian society is to kill all the bourgeoisie, confiscate their property, and redistribute it equally among all the members of society. And with that, you have officially eradicated poverty, crime, injustice, corruption, discrimination, sexism. Everything bad in humanity will have completely vanished upon changing the social order in the way I described. That's all that you need to do to eradicate evil from the human heart. That is an extremely simplistic solution, at least according to Dalrymple. So if you recognize that there are no simple solutions to complex problems, which is how the tragic view sees it, you'll realize that we have our work cut out for us. That the solutions will be just as complex and difficult as the problems. And most people, it is, I think, human nature to desire to want to find simple solutions to complex problems. We don't like complexity. We like simplicity. We like black and white answers to questions. And that's just not the way it is in life. Let's turn now to the final article, What is Poverty? This is a very interesting piece on what poverty really means. Now, when we use the term poverty in the Western world, we use it in a relative sense. What do I mean by that? Well, every society is going to have a top 1%. Every society is going to have a bottom 20%. Every society is going to have a bottom 30%. So the poor, let's say in the United States, I don't know exactly what the percentage is, but let's just say that the poor are designated as the bottom 20% of the income distribution scale in this country. So if the poorest person in the United States made $100,000 a year, right, then you can see how deceptive poverty would be, right? If the average salary, household income for the bottom 20% of the income scale in this country were in the six figures, you would be a poor person who makes $100,000 a year, right? But you would be poor only in relation to the rest of the income distribution that is higher than you, right? You would be poor in relation to the guy who makes $500,000 a year. But at the $100,000 a year, at least in today's money, does not make you poor in the United States. That makes you quite comfortable. So it's a little deceptive to talk about poverty when you do so in relative terms. I'll put it this way: I'd rather be poor. I would rather live under the poverty line in the United States than in Liberia or in Sierra Leone. There's a huge difference. So let's look at the quotes. Poverty has been redefined in industrial countries so that anyone at the lower end of the income distribution is poor, ex officio, as it were, poor by virtue of having less than the rich. And of course, by this logic, the only way of eliminating poverty is by an egalitarian redistribution of wealth, even if the society as a whole were to become poorer as a result. Such redistribution was the goal of the welfare state. But it has not eliminated poverty despite the vast sums expended, and despite the fact that the poor are now substantially richer, indeed are not by traditional standards poor at all. As long as the rich exist, so must the poor as we now define them. And that's the problem with understanding poverty as relative to wealth. If we were to understand poverty in absolute terms and define poverty as not having enough food to eat, not having a roof over one's head, not having any access to healthcare, not having access to education, right? If we were to understand poverty in that sense, then very few Americans would fall under that category. Certainly far fewer than 20% of the society. Last quote, I asked the doctor from Madras if poverty was the word he would use to describe this woman's situation. Now, you might remember from the article that Dalrymple visited with many doctors who came in from India and other parts of the third world came to visit him in England. And they came in with very high hopes, thinking that the welfare state that they had heard of did an amazing job of dealing with the issue of poverty. And they were surprised to realize that it had quite the opposite effect. And so, Dalrymple, in many of his articles, he talks about patients of his who get themselves in these really horrible situations, women who choose to live with physically abusive boyfriends and even kick their own children out of the house, and because the abusive boyfriends don't like the woman's children, and they allow themselves to be abused and mistreated, and they have children by these men, and then they go on to another man and have more children. And so these are people that choose to live in this way because there are no incentives not to do so. In fact, the welfare state, according to Dalrymple, creates economic incentives to live in just this manner. The more children you have out of wedlock, the more subsidies you get from the government. So it creates an inducement to live in a reckless manner, as we saw in the Frivolity of Evil article. Okay, coming back to the quote, he said it was not, that her problem was that she accepted no limits to her own behavior, that she did not fear the possibility of hunger, the condemnation of her own parents or neighbors, or God. In other words, the squalor of England was not economic, but spiritual, moral, and cultural. So here we have the fascinating distinction between material poverty, the poverty traditionally understood as not having enough food to eat or not having a place to live and so forth. The distinction between material poverty and spiritual poverty. And this is what the welfare state ushers in, according to Dalrymple. It's not material poverty, because the poor in England, the so-called poor in England, have abundant material goods in the sense that they don't go hungry. In fact, obesity is more of a problem in the British slums than malnutrition, or hunger, I should say. The problem is not material deprivation, but spiritual and moral decay. As you've surely seen from the Frivolity of Evil article, for example, the welfare state, according to Dalrymple, undermines one's sense of moral responsibility, personal responsibility. It erodes one's independence, one's ambition, one's self-reliance, and it creates a sense of entitlement. And for Dalrymple, these are catastrophic for the human soul. The intentions are good of the welfare state. The intentions are to help those at the bottom. But for Dalrymple, what this does, it may take care of material poverty, but it creates a far worse kind of poverty, the poverty of the soul. And this is what he wants his readers to face and to grapple with. Okay, well, that concludes our Dalrymple chapter discussion. I hope you found this helpful. Thank you for listening.